Welcome my channel. Today we're uncovering a powerful and nearly forgotten story, Kafele Nzinga of Angola, a name history tried to erase forever. This is not just a name, it's a life buried under colonial silence, broken records, and deliberate forgetting. Before we begin, tell me in the comments where you're watching from, and make sure you subscribe because stories like this take deep research, cross-checking old sources, and real effort to uncover true historical facts that were never meant to survive. Long before Kafele Nzinga's name was scattered across broken records and rewritten by foreign hands, his story began in the heart of Angola, in a land shaped by rivers, iron soil, and powerful kingdoms that existed long before Europeans ever set foot on its shores. He was born into a world that already had structure, law, culture, and memory, a world history would later pretend did not exist. Angola in the late 16th and early 17th centuries was not a nameless place of tribes, as colonial narratives claimed. It was home to organized states like the Kingdom of Congo and Ndongo, societies with diplomacy, armies, spiritual systems, and deeply rooted family lineages. Kafele Nzinga was born into one of these worlds, where names carried history and identity, not just sound. His name alone tells us everything history tried to silence. Kafele was not random. It was a name tied to duty, strength, and leadership, often given to those expected to protect or guide others. Nzinga was even more powerful. It linked him to a lineage associated with authority, strategy, and resistance. In Angola, names were not chosen lightly. They were spoken over children with intention, often connected to ancestors, events at birth, or expectations placed upon them. To be named Nzinga meant belonging to a story larger than oneself. It meant memory, and memory was dangerous to those who came later to conquer. Kafele was likely born into a community that valued oral history just as much as written record. Elders passed down knowledge through stories, proverbs, and rituals, ensuring that even without ink and paper, nothing important was forgotten. Children grew up knowing who they were, where they came from, and what their people had endured. He would have learned early about land boundaries, clan responsibilities, and the spiritual forces believed to govern life and death. These were not superstitions, but systems of meaning that structured everyday life. To outsiders, this world was invisible. To those inside it, it was everything. But Angola during Kafele Nzinga's early life was already under threat. Portuguese traders had established coastal footholds, initially welcomed through diplomacy and trade. What began as exchange soon turned into extraction. Weapons, religion, and treaties slowly gave way to violence, betrayal, and human capture. Entire villages were destabilized as European demand for enslaved labor grew. Raids increased. Local conflicts were manipulated. Traditional leadership structures were targeted or corrupted. And people like Kafele, educated, rooted, named, became especially valuable targets because removing leaders made resistance harder. There is strong reason to believe that Kafele Nzinga was born free, not enslaved. He would have known freedom as the natural state of existence, not something to be earned or granted. That matters because it changes how we understand what was later taken from him. He wasn't born into chains. Chains were forced onto a life that already had meaning, language, and purpose. This is the part history often avoids acknowledging, because it breaks the lie that enslaved people came from nothing. As a young boy, Kafele would have witnessed the changes creeping into daily life, the tension in adult conversations, the fear in night watches, the sudden disappearances of neighbors. He may have seen missionaries arrive with crosses and foreign words, offering salvation while preparing the ground for domination. He may have heard stories of ships that swallowed people whole and never returned them. Even before capture, the shadow of enslavement loomed large over Angola. Yet despite this, his early life would not have been defined solely by fear. There would have been ceremonies, songs, and communal gatherings. There would have been lessons about bravery, endurance, and honor. He would have learned who he was before the world tried to rename him. And that identity, forged before displacement, is exactly what made his story dangerous to erase. When colonial forces later recorded names, they often shortened them, changed them, or removed them entirely. African names were stripped because they carried power, calling someone simply boy, or assigning a European name made domination easier. But Kafele Nzinga's original name survived in fragments, whispers, and oral memory, refusing to disappear completely. That survival begins here, in Angola, in a place that colonial history preferred to describe as empty or primitive, because acknowledging its fullness would mean admitting what was destroyed. Understanding Kafele Nzinga's origins means understanding that his story did not begin with captivity. It began with belonging, with land, with language, with ancestry. And that is why history tried so hard to erase it, because remembering where he came from forces us to confront what was stolen, not just from one man, but from an entire civilization. The importance of Kafele Nzinga's name and lineage cannot be understood through a European lens alone, because in Angola, a name was never just a label. It was history spoken aloud. It carried ancestry, responsibility, and destiny all at once. When Kafele Nzinga was named, he was not simply being identified. He was being placed within a living chain of memory that stretched backward through generations and forward into expectations yet to be fulfilled. This is precisely why his name became something history later tried so hard to erase. In many Angolan societies, lineage determined one's role in the community. Family lines were remembered not through written documents, but through oral recitation, ceremonies, and communal acknowledgement. Elders could trace bloodlines through stories alone, naming ancestors, deeds, victories, failures, and lessons. To belong to a known lineage meant protection, status, and voice. Kafele Nzinga's lineage placed him among people who were not anonymous, not disposable, and certainly not meant to vanish quietly from record. The name Nzinga carried exceptional weight. It was associated with political intelligence, resilience, and authority. It echoed through Central African history as a marker of leadership, often tied to individuals who negotiated, resisted, and adapted in times of invasion and upheaval. To bear the name Nzinga was to inherit expectation, to think strategically, to protect community interests, and to remember who the people were even when outsiders tried to redefine them. Names like this frightened colonial powers because they represented continuity, not submission. Colonial systems relied on fragmentation. To control people, you first had to sever them from their identity. Removing a name removed the past. Removing lineage removed loyalty. Removing memory removed resistance. This is why African names were among the first things taken during enslavement. Kafele Nzinga's name, when encountered by traders or record keepers, would have been seen as inconvenient, too complex, too meaningful, too rooted in a world they were trying to dismantle. Simpler names made ownership easier, Erasure made domination permanent. Lineage also carried spiritual meaning. Ancestors were not viewed as gone. They were present, guiding and watching. A name connected the living to the dead, and the dead to the unborn. Kafele Nzinga would have grown up understanding that his actions reflected not only on himself, but on those who came before him and those who would follow. This sense of responsibility shaped character. It taught restraint, courage, and accountability. It also meant that to strip him of his name was not just an insult. It was a spiritual violation. When enslaved Africans arrived in foreign lands, colonial systems deliberately broke these connections. Lineages were scrambled. Families were separated. Names were replaced with numbers or Christian names that carried no personal meaning. But in some cases, fragments survived. A whispered name passed to a child. A remembered ancestor spoken quietly at night. A refusal to answer to a false identity. Kafele Nzinga's name survived in these fragments, not fully intact, but not destroyed either. This survival matters because it exposes the lie that enslaved people were blank slates. Kafele Nzinga did not arrive in history nameless. He was made nameless by force. His lineage did not disappear naturally, it was intentionally obscured. Colonial records often listed Africans without surnames or replaced them with the names of enslavers, severing bloodlines on paper, even when they continued in memory. Over time, what wasn't written was treated as if it never existed. But lineage does not require ink to survive. It requires people who remember. Oral histories preserved the idea that Kafele Nzinga came from somewhere specific, that he belonged to a people who had governance, diplomacy, and culture. Even when his descendants or community members could no longer trace the full line, they remembered that he was not born into silence. That remembrance itself became an act of resistance. The political importance of his lineage also explains why history avoided him. Acknowledging that someone like Kafele Nzinga existed means acknowledging that Africa produced leaders, thinkers, and strategists long before colonial contact. It disrupts the narrative that civilization was imported rather than invaded. His name contradicts the idea that African identity began with enslavement. It didn't. Enslavement interrupted something that was already whole. Today, recovering names like Kafele Nzinga is not about nostalgia, it's about correction. It's about restoring what was deliberately distorted. His lineage reminds us that history is not only written by those in power, but also carried by those who survived. Every time his name is spoken, it reconnects him to the world that shaped him, the people who named him, and the identity that was never truly lost, only buried. And that is why Kafele Nzinga's name still matters, because names are memory, and memory, once recovered, cannot be erased again. The erasure of Kafele Nzinga from colonial records was not accidental, careless, or the result of poor documentation. It was deliberate. To understand how his existence was distorted and nearly wiped away, you have to understand how colonial record-keeping worked, and more importantly, why it worked the way it did. History, as written by colonial powers, was not meant to preserve truth. It was meant to justify domination. When Portuguese and later European administrators encountered people like Kafele Nzinga, they faced a problem. He did not fit the story they wanted to tell. He had a name with meaning, a lineage tied to authority, and a background rooted in organized African societies. Acknowledging that reality would undermine the narrative that Africa was chaotic, uncivilized, and in need of control. So instead of recording him accurately, they reshaped him on paper or removed him entirely. One of the most common methods of erasure was renaming. African names were often labeled unpronounceable or irrelevant and replaced with Christian or European ones. In shipping logs, plantation ledgers, and baptismal records, individuals were reduced to first names only, nicknames, or generic labels like male Angolan or boy. Lineage vanished in a single stroke of a pen. In Kafele Nzinga's case, surviving fragments suggest his full name was shortened, altered, or omitted entirely, severing his connection to ancestry in official documents. Another method was fragmentation. Colonial records rarely followed individuals across time. A person might appear once in a port register, once in a plantation inventory, and never again, each time described differently, with no effort to link identities. Ages were guessed. Origins were generalized. Families were not recorded at all. This made it nearly impossible for later historians to trace a continuous life. Kafele Nzinga becomes a shadow, present in pieces, never whole. There was also intentional silence. Colonial administrators chose what was worth recording. Acts of resistance, leadership, or influence by enslaved Africans were minimized or ignored unless they could be framed as criminal behavior. If Kafele Nzinga demonstrated intelligence, authority, or influence over others, that would have been threatening. The safest option for the record was omission. Silence became a tool as powerful as chains. Language itself was weaponized. African societies were described using vague, dismissive terms. Complex political structures were labeled tribal. Leaders were called chiefs, regardless of their actual status. Individuals like Kafele Nzinga were stripped of context, making them appear interchangeable and insignificant. Once context is removed, humanity follows. Missionary records added another layer of distortion. Conversion documents often replaced African identities with Christian ones, presenting this as spiritual salvation while quietly assisting cultural erasure. A baptized name erased the old one on paper, even if the original survived in memory. Over generations, descendants searching archives would find only the imposed name, never knowing what was taken. Even later historians contributed to the erasure by relying solely on colonial documents. Oral histories were dismissed as unreliable. African testimony was treated as folklore rather than evidence. This meant that figures like Kafele Nzinga, preserved in spoken memory, were excluded from official history. The absence of his name in European archives was taken as proof that he never mattered, when in reality, it proved the opposite. What makes this erasure especially cruel is that it was self-reinforcing. Once a name disappeared from records, future documents referenced earlier ones, repeating the absence. Silence compounded silence. By the time modern scholars began questioning these gaps, generations had passed. Paper had replaced memory, and paper had been designed to forget him. But erasure is never complete. Fragments remain, a surname altered but recognizable, a birthplace listed too specifically to ignore, a repeated description that hints at the same person. When historians piece these fragments together alongside oral traditions, a different picture emerges. Kafele Nzinga was not missing from history. He was buried inside it. Understanding how his existence was distorted forces us to rethink how we read historical records. Absence does not mean insignificance. Silence does not mean consent. And distortion does not mean confusion. It often means fear. Colonial systems erased Kafele Nzinga, because acknowledging him would have required acknowledging African complexity, leadership, and humanity. Recovering his story is not about filling a gap. It's about exposing how the gap was created and why. Because every erased name like his tells us less about the person who vanished from the page, and far more about the power that needed them gone. Even as colonial records sought to erase Kafele Nzinga, oral histories carried his story through generations, refusing to be silenced. In Angola and among the diaspora communities scattered across the Americas, elders spoke of him not as a mere name, but as a presence, someone who embodied resilience, intellect, and the continuity of culture. These oral traditions became a lifeline for memory, preserving details that official documents deliberately omitted or distorted. Stories of Kafele Nzinga were shared at night around fires, in whispered conversations, and through songs that encoded history in rhythm and rhyme, ensuring that even if the written word failed, the truth would survive. Oral histories offered more than just a recounting of events. They captured character, lineage, and context in ways that colonial documentation could not. Elders would tell younger generations about his bravery, his leadership qualities, and his understanding of the land and its people. They remembered the small yet significant details, his family, the customs he upheld, the ways he resisted erasure, because these were not simply facts. They were markers of identity. In societies where literacy in European languages was limited by force and circumstance, memory itself became the repository of history, with each retelling reinforcing connections to ancestors and cultural heritage. These stories also resisted the imposed narratives of European colonizers. While official records often depicted Africans as passive or subordinate, oral traditions preserved the full humanity of Kafele Nzinga and those around him. He was remembered as an active agent in his own life, someone with agency, intelligence, and the capacity to shape events within his community. This is critical because oral histories counter the dominant narrative that Africans were mere objects of colonial history, instead portraying them as individuals with complex identities and roles. Oral traditions also preserved warnings and lessons within the stories. The elders who recounted Kafele Nzinga's life did so not only to honor him, but to instruct future generations on resilience, leadership, and the importance of cultural continuity. The stories conveyed moral and strategic lessons, how to navigate danger, maintain personal integrity under oppressive systems, and honor the ancestors even when the world around them tried to erase their existence. In this way, Kafele Nzinga's legacy became both a historical account and a tool for survival, ensuring that his spirit and influence endured beyond the constraints of colonial erasure. The resilience of oral memory was particularly powerful because it operated independently of colonial control. European record keeping could be destroyed, altered, or hidden, but memory could not be so easily manipulated. Communities preserved the name, lineage, and deeds of Kafele Nzinga through repeated storytelling, often embedding these narratives within broader cultural practices, ceremonies, and rituals. The repetition of these stories ensured continuity across time, even when individuals were separated by the Atlantic slave trade or other forced migrations. In this sense, oral histories acted as both a counter, record and a protective mechanism against the deliberate silencing of African identities. Furthermore, oral histories offered layers of nuance that colonial records could never capture. They conveyed emotional truths, the pride, grief, resilience, and resistance that defined Kafele Nzinga's life. These were not dry facts. They were lived experiences passed down in evocative and memorable ways. For example, a single story might recount his strategic decisions during conflict, the advice he gave to younger members of the community, and the respect he commanded from elders, all in a way that communicated both the historical reality and its social and emotional significance. These layers of meaning gave Kafele Nzinga a presence and vitality that could never be replicated in the flat, bureaucratic language of colonial archives. Even in the diaspora, when communities were forcibly separated from their homeland, these oral histories preserved connections to origin, lineage, and identity. People who were enslaved or descended from enslaved populations carried fragments of Kafele Nzinga's story across oceans, blending it with local experiences while maintaining its core truths. This adaptability ensured that the story survived across continents and generations, forming a bridge between past and present, memory and identity, homeland and exile. In the modern era, oral histories have become invaluable to historians attempting to reconstruct the life of Kafele Nzinga. Where written records fail or lie, these stories provide context, detail, and continuity. They illuminate his origins, his lineage, and the cultural world that colonial forces tried to erase. Importantly, they demonstrate that history is not only written by the powerful, but also preserved by those whose voices were deliberately marginalized. Kafele Nzinga's existence, influence, and legacy endure because communities refuse to let memory die. Ultimately, oral histories ensured that Kafele Nzinga's life was never fully erased. They carried his name, his deeds, and his significance across time and space, resisting the distortions and silences of colonial documentation. By preserving both fact and meaning, these stories created a living archive that allowed Kafele Nzinga to remain more than a footnote in history. He became a symbol of resistance, identity, and the power of memory against deliberate erasure. It is through these oral traditions that modern generations can finally recognize the full scope of his life, his lineage, and the historical world from which he emerged. The role of resistance, identity, and memory in Kafele Nzinga's life is central to understanding why his story has survived despite centuries of deliberate erasure. From the very beginning, Kafele Nzinga existed in a society where names, lineage, and communal knowledge were not merely cultural artifacts, they were instruments of power and survival. In Angola, identity was deeply tied to social, spiritual, and political structures. To know who you were and where you came from meant you could navigate the complex hierarchies of your community, defend yourself and your family, and maintain a sense of dignity in a world that would later seek to strip all of that away. Kafele Nzinga's identity was therefore not optional or superficial. It was essential both as a claim to existence and as a shield against domination. Resistance was woven into his life in both subtle and profound ways. Even before contact with colonial forces, Africans in Angola exercised agency in ways that challenged the narratives Europeans wanted to impose. They defended territories, negotiated treaties, maintained cultural practices, and protected sacred knowledge. For Kafele Nzinga, resistance likely took the form of preserving his cultural identity, honoring his lineage, and asserting the legitimacy of his family's authority, all acts that colonial administrators, who sought to replace African systems with their own, would have found threatening. His very existence, fully aware of its ancestry and rights, was an act of defiance against a system intent on erasing him. Memory was the connective tissue that made resistance possible. While colonial powers could destroy documents, rename individuals, and scatter communities, memory persisted. Elders passed down stories, songs, and rituals that ensured the names, deeds, and wisdom of people like Kafele Nzinga survived. Each retelling reinforced identity and social cohesion, making it impossible for colonizers to erase the past entirely. In this sense, Kafele Nzinga's life was sustained by collective remembrance, a living proof that culture and history could survive even in the face of systematic oppression. Memory was both a weapon and a refuge, a way to assert that no matter how far one was removed from their homeland or stripped of legal recognition, the essence of one's life could not be stolen. Kafele Nzinga's resistance also extended to the preservation of his name, which carried the weight of history, leadership, and ancestral guidance. Names in his culture were not decorative, they were functional. They encoded lineage, social role, and spiritual responsibility. By preserving his name in memory, orally and within communities, he resisted the colonial effort to reduce people to anonymous laborers or property. This act of naming was deeply political. It was a refusal to be erased, a challenge to the dominant narratives, and an assertion that African systems of knowledge and authority were legitimate and enduring. Identity resistance and memory intersected in another crucial way. They allowed Kafele Nzinga's story to survive transatlantic dislocation. Even as communities were torn apart by the slave trade, stories of his existence, his name, lineage, and deeds traveled with people who were forcibly removed from Angola. In enslaved communities in the Americas, oral history became the lifeline for African heritage. Knowledge of Kafele Nzinga, embedded in storytelling, song, and ritual, provided a sense of continuity and belonging, allowing displaced people to maintain cultural coherence despite extreme trauma. In essence, resistance was not always physical, it was intellectual, spiritual, and social. Moreover, Kafele Nzinga's story exemplifies how memory preserves more than facts. It preserves meaning. While colonial archives might record dates, transactions, or numbers of captives, oral traditions captured context, moral lessons, and social significance. They preserved his role as a leader, his connection to community, and the values he embodied. In resisting erasure, memory became an interpretive lens, teaching future generations about resilience, the consequences of colonialism, and the power of identity in survival. Through memory, Kafele Nzinga became more than a historical figure. He became a symbol of enduring African agency. The legacy of resistance in his life also reminds us that identity is not only personal but collective. Kafele Nzinga's story demonstrates that preserving one's name, ancestry, and cultural knowledge is a form of defiance against systems of oppression. His life illustrates how individuals and communities can resist, not only through rebellion or escape, but also by refusing to let memory die, by teaching younger generations, and by keeping cultural practices alive in the face of systematic erasure. In contemporary terms, remembering Kafele Nzinga is itself an act of resistance. Reclaiming his identity from obscurity challenges centuries of colonial distortion, restoring a historical truth that was deliberately suppressed. It honors his lineage and reasserts the legitimacy of the cultural systems that colonial forces tried to destroy. Every time his name is spoken, every time his story is shared, it reinforces the lessons of resistance, the importance of memory, and the power of identity to survive even the most violent attempts at erasure. Ultimately, Kafele Nzinga's life teaches that resistance, identity, and memory are inseparable. One could not exist without the others. His story demonstrates that even when external forces attempt to rewrite history, the persistence of name, the continuity of culture, and the preservation of memory serve as invisible but unbreakable chains connecting past, present, and future. Through these threads, Kafele Nzinga continues to assert his presence, a life that history tried to erase, but could never fully erase. A testament to the enduring power of human agency, cultural identity, and collective memory. The significance of remembering Kafele Nzinga today goes far beyond honoring a single individual. It is about reclaiming a history that colonial powers tried to erase and recognizing the broader truths his life represents. Kafele Nzinga is not just a name on a forgotten page of Angolan history. He is a symbol of resilience, identity, and the survival of culture under oppression. Remembering him challenges the narratives that have long dominated our understanding of Africa and its people, which often portray the continent as a passive victim of colonialism rather than a place of vibrant societies, political sophistication, and strategic agency. To remember Kafele Nzinga is to confront the deliberate silencing of African voices and to acknowledge that those voices, though muted on paper, survived through oral memory, cultural continuity, and acts of resistance. In modern times, this act of remembrance takes on multiple layers of importance. On a cultural level, it restores pride and visibility to African heritage that was undermined through centuries of forced erasure. Names like Kafele Nzinga carry stories of leadership, ancestry, and social responsibility that were denied in colonial records. For descendants of those affected by the transatlantic slave trade, acknowledging his life is a way to reconnect with a lineage and history that were intentionally disrupted. It gives context to the origins of African communities worldwide and underscores that these histories are not inventions but lived realities that survived despite violence and oppression. Beyond cultural reclamation, remembering Kafele Nzinga also provides a crucial corrective to the historical record. For too long, European accounts have dominated our understanding of African history, often portraying it through a lens of ignorance, chaos, or inferiority. Kafele Nzinga's story demonstrates that African societies had structure, governance, and systems of knowledge long before colonial intrusion. By acknowledging his life and the significance of his lineage, historians, educators, and communities can begin to dismantle centuries of misrepresentation, offering a more accurate and nuanced understanding of the continent's past. His name, and the story behind it, serves as evidence that Africa's history was interrupted, not non-existent, and that resistance to erasure was present from the earliest interactions with colonial forces. There is also a moral and ethical dimension to remembering Kafele Nzinga. Erasure is not merely a historical oversight. It is a deliberate act that has real-world consequences. By recovering and amplifying his story, we bear witness to the injustices committed against him and his people. This is not only an act of historical justice, but also a reminder of the human cost of colonialism, the lives, identities, and cultures disrupted and devalued in the process. In honoring his memory, we acknowledge the resilience and dignity of those who endured oppression and assert that their lives, names, and contributions matter, even when the official records say otherwise. Remembering Kafele Nzinga also connects us to the ongoing struggle for cultural survival and identity today. Across the African diaspora, communities continue to confront the legacies of colonialism, slavery, and systemic erasure. His story becomes a touchstone for understanding how identity and memory can survive through oral histories, traditions, and community practices, even when formal documentation is lacking. By bringing his life into contemporary consciousness, we emphasize the continuity of African heritage and the importance of preserving stories that might otherwise fade from memory. In doing so, we honor not only Kafele Nzinga, but countless others whose names and lives were deliberately obscured. Moreover, remembering him encourages critical engagement with history itself. It challenges the audience to question whose stories have been prioritized and whose have been ignored, to recognize the biases embedded in historical records, and to seek out voices that have been systematically silenced. Kafele Nzinga's life is an entry point into these deeper conversations about historiography, power, and memory, revealing how the act of remembering is itself an act of resistance against centuries of manipulation and suppression. Finally, the significance of remembering Kafele Nzinga lies in its transformative power. To speak his name, to tell his story, and to honor his lineage is to resist erasure once again, this time consciously and intentionally. It restores agency to a life that history attempted to render invisible, and ensures that future generations understand the value of identity, culture, and resilience. Kafele Nzinga's memory becomes a living testament to the enduring strength of human spirit, the importance of cultural continuity, and the unbreakable power of stories that refuse to be forgotten. In remembering him today, we do more than reclaim a name. We reclaim history itself. We restore dignity, and we acknowledge the interconnectedness of past and present. Kafele Nzinga's life reminds us that even in the face of deliberate erasure, memory survives, and that surviving memory is a powerful tool for justice, understanding, and truth. His story teaches us that no amount of suppression can fully erase identity, and that remembering is, ultimately, an act of defiance, preservation, and hope.